Well, welcome to Noel's World of Whiskey. I'm going to do something different tonight. I am going to use my trusty computer. Got a little bit of a challenge here. Basically, I was into my notebook the last week here that I brought back from Scotland, and I wanted to share something with you. There's a lot of notes. I'm trying to kind of condense them in that, and if you know me, I like to tell you the whole story, not the Reader's Digest version, but I sort of did it on the computer. I condensed it as much as possible. So basically, what I'm going to do with the computer is kind of help me out here, because this is basically here's a question I'm going to ask you. First, did you know that Scotland has more than 150 operating distilleries today? And I'm certain you all know that. Of course, we know it's the greatest whiskey concentration production in the world. And you know the 5 regions, and that's the Highlands, the Lowlands, the Speyside, Islay, and Campbelltown. And over half of these distilleries have visitor centers, so we can actually visit them. If you're planning a trip to Scotland, I mean, I know the challenges, in that it's about how much time you got, and that time really dictates, where you really want to be in Scotland. Is it a whiskey distillery tour? Do you want to see the castles, the incredible Scottish scenery? Do you want to get down into Wales and Great Britain? So it really does dictate, what you're focused on in terms of distilleries. Now, I'm going to say here's another question: is what are the most amazing distilleries in Scotland to visit? And I get asked this all the time, by the way. And I usually pause before giving an answer for a reason. Now, most of you who watch this channel already have heard my stories of the 3,000 miles of highways and back roads I traveled. And it's kind of interesting, because when I get asked that question, I kind of ask myself the question: I should maybe the most amazing distilleries in Scotland include the words beautiful and unique. And for most of these distilleries, I think it's going to be the standouts, the ones I'm not going to forget. So I'd like to share with you my knowledge and opinions of what the most amazing distilleries are going to be. And I also want to, I had a lot of conversations with, the distillery tourists, and I think it's important to kind of share what they had to say. Now, a lot of these distillery tourists are not whiskey geeks. They might talk about the photogenic appeal of the distillery, including the gardens. They might talk about the tour, the architecture, and of course the whiskey. They don't necessarily have to have a lot of knowledge of the whiskey making process. I mean, that's us, the whiskey geeks, the nerds. And I also like to share what the tour guides had to say. It all kind of, I think, contributes to what are the most amazing distilleries. So this is for you that are planning a trip to Scotland, and now it's time to make that decision. What distilleries are we going to visit? Now, I'll remind you that I visited a lot of distilleries, so this could be a really long list. And not all the distilleries I'm going to mention here are going to be the most amazing, but they're worth a visit. So I'm gonna sort of focus on their architecture, the beautiful gardens, the picturesque environment, and as well obviously the visitor center. You don't really get a real feel for a distillery unless you go through the visitor center, and if you do a tour, you even get more. Now, not all these distilleries get the same fame for their whiskey as the OSWA Top 10 or the Dramface Top 40, which I've already covered in a previous review. And of course, in that review, I chose Springbank as the number one choice. And of course, so did the OSWA and the Dramface voters. was mostly the whiskey making process, the personal experience I had with the staff, the whiskey. But I never saw it as the prettiest or most striking piece of architecture, or gardens or setting. And you know, Campbelltown is a bit out of the way. It's not a great concentration of distilleries today. There's 3 distilleries. We went to see all 3 of those distilleries. So we did go out of the way. And of course, Springbank, I really wanted to see Springbank. Then Glengyle, you know, part of the Springbank investment. And Glen Scotia, which we should never forget because it has a history as well and has some pretty good whiskey. But, you know, there was a time in Campbelltown when there was 30 distilleries. In the late 1800s, that was its heyday. And today, of course, we've got 3. There is some more being built. Now, we had a vehicle, so we could choose the routes which had the densest concentration of distilleries. And, you know, I also wanted to see the highlights and the castles, and I want to see that beautiful Scottish scenery. So it's kind of a trade-off of where you really want to be. Now, you know, every place we stayed, you know, including Edinburgh and Glasgow, had access to distilleries. And you know, there's distilleries around Glasgow, there's distilleries around Edinburgh. I think Aberdeen had probably the least in the immediate periphery, though it is changing in Aberdeen. We made our hub Inverness, and I don't regret it. But if you were just focused on distilleries, I would probably head a little to the east to Elgin. The Elgin area, Keith, Dufftown, they basically do have the biggest concentration of distilleries in the Speyside and also in all of Scotland and all of the UK. If you're heading north of Inverness, the first 60 miles, you've got 7 distilleries, all the way up to Clynelish. And then it's another 50 miles to get to Old Pulteney, and of course the newer Wolfburn distillery. If you're traveling that same distance in the Speyside, you're talking 5 times as many distilleries. So if you're heading to Scotland on a distillery tour, and we need to make a must-see list, what other distilleries are worth visiting? Now, we're going to wander through Scotland, so I'm advising you to have your Google map ready, because you're going to need it. And remember, this is not just for the whiskey enthusiasts, this is for everybody. So let's start with the physical beauty of both the distillery, the surrounding landscape, and maybe something unique and special. An example of this might be Blair Athol, which was one of the first distilleries we hit when we were heading up into the Highlands north of Edinburgh. It could have been a painting on my wall. Its entrance is covered in ivy, and that changes color with the seasons. And it has something special and different. 2 mash tuns. And as you expect, one is for the whiskey making process, but the second one, it was a decommissioned mash tun from Clynelish. And it was uniquely re-engineered and repurposed into a bar, which is kind of neat because it's not going to waste. I just say there's no other bar like it in the rest of Scotland. Now if we shoot down toward Glasgow, Glengoyne, we've all heard of Glengoyne. And that distillery snuggles right up to Dengoyne Hill, which is 13 miles north of Glasgow. And it uniquely sits in the middle of the Highland lowland line. And I don't know any other distillery that does that. The whiskey making is in the Highlands, and its warehouses where that whiskey's maturing is in the lowlands. And the 200-year-old distillery has some of its classic original buildings. And it is such a quaint setting that some tour books claim it to be the prettiest distillery in Scotland. Now this next distillery, I'm going to pronounce it right, Royal Lochnagar, It was actually recommended to me by a liquor store manager who was very connected in the whiskey. His wife actually worked for Diageo. I think she was one of the executive people with Diageo. So he had some interesting, some interesting insights as to that distillery. So I had to see it. It's a very small, classic Highland distillery built of granite in a scenic setting on the River Dee next to the royal family's Balmoral Castle. Now, this was the first distillery, the very first distillery it was built in the 1800s in that area, and it was licensed in 1823. So it was obviously selling illegal whiskey, for 20 plus years and probably longer. It was burnt down twice after it was legalized by angry illicit distillers, and the third rebuilt in 1845 has actually survived till today. The owner, John Bagg, invited Queen Victoria and Prince Albert from the nearby Balmoral Castle there to visit the distillery. And they were so fond of the whiskey that it was granted the royal warrant. And another popular distillery, and this isn't on the whiskey trail, and a little bit more isolated, and it's called Glengarrick, which is a well-known whiskey. We see it over here, and it's about 20 miles northwest of Aberdeen. And to south of that, there is Glencaddam, which a lot of you have probably heard of, but it does make the OSWA and the Dramface Top 40.
Glencaddam Distillery has recently gained a lot of popularity amongst the whiskey enthusiast community and does have a visitor center. It is about 40 miles south of Aberdeen via A90 and A92. Fettercairn Distillery has also recently gained popularity and does have a visitor center. It is 10 miles north of Glencaddam on B966 and 35 miles south of Aberdeen. You can travel north on Highway A90 past Glencaddam and Aberdeen to get to the Speyside, or on A9 past Blair Athol through Inverness.
Now, the west coast of Oban and its Highland Distillery is the most visited and recommended tour in Scotland. And it's also the gateway to the Hebrides Islands. And this distillery was built in 1794, and the town grew around it. So this distillery is stuck in the middle of town, and there's no room for expansion. But it's interesting because the distillery kind of it blends into the town, so it doesn't really stand out. But I was kind of fascinated with the old slate blocks. They were so well preserved. And I looked at the construction of them, and it was like I'm going back in time. This building is basically frozen in time. And our tour group felt it was one of the best distillery tours they'd done. So now, nestled on the opposite coast is one of my favorites, Glenmorangie. And it has the tallest stills in Scotland, and they're nicknamed the Giraffes. It's a beautiful sight to be seen both in and on the outside in the gardens. Now, not as well known as Glenmorangie is its elderly neighbor, Balblair. And it's about 5 miles to the west. It's actually the 4th oldest distillery in Scotland. And it's situated in a very picturesque landscape, and I look at it as kind of like frozen in time. It's gaining popularity as a tour destination today. And 14 miles south of Glenmorangie is the iconic 186-year-old Dalmore Distillery, built of granite and has a traditional pagoda roof. It is a classic design from the Victoria era, nestled right next to the seashore. And it has an interesting history. It survived a catastrophic Navy explosion in 1920. And it ended up in a legal battle with the Royal Navy that lasted for years in the courts and eventually even ended up in the House of Lords. All 3 of these distilleries are less than an hour drive north of Inverness, and they're well worth the visit. Now, if you're in Inverness, The 186-year-old Singleton of the Glenord is conveniently just 22 miles to the northwest. Now, it's not a stunning site, but it's an interesting mix of some very old distillery buildings and a new modern-looking visitor center.
Glenord Distillery is only 15 miles from Inverness, and the ultra-modern visitor center is a contrast to the old buildings.
And it's known to do a pretty good tour. Now we're going to talk about the miniature Edredor Highland Distillery that could be called the cute little storybook distillery. And it was one of Scotland's most visited distilleries at one time. You know, all of the old distillery equipment, including the two stills, are minute compared to other distilleries. And it does things the old way, by hand. When we were at Edredor, the visitor center was closed. We got a chance to look around, but there was a closure in the visitor center. And if you're planning on visiting it, and it would be well worth a visit if it is reopened. So check ahead. Now, just west of Perth, above the lowland line, is the Highland Distillery of Glenturret. And it's also known for doing things old school. Its famous mouser, Towser the Cat, set records as a mouse catcher and is in the Guinness Book of Records. Now, it was built in 1763 as Hosh Distillery and sold untaxed whiskey, but it wasn't licensed until 1818. And it's contested to be the oldest distillery in Scotland. Now, William Grant & Sons. They are the largest of the independent family-owned companies in the spirits business. And they're still family-owned. And their prize is Glenfiddich, known as the Speyside Giant. I think that was the very first single malt I ever had. And that goes way back. I don't know, it was in the 70s or whatever. Now, this is the largest distillery with the most stills in Scotland. And next to Glenfiddich is its smaller sister, the popular Balvenie Distillery. And both Glenfiddich and the smaller Balvenie were built during the Victorian era. And because they're surrounded by gardens, there is some beauty to be said about them. And that's what I felt. There was these old buildings, but there was these beautiful gardens. Literally, you have to book 3-4 months ahead if you want to get a tour in those distilleries. Now, speaking of giants, it will also have to include Glenlivet Distillery. It's 14 miles southwest of Glenfiddich, and it has comparable production. Uh, 200 years ago, Glenlivet was considered the highest quality and the most sought-after whiskey in Scotland. And there was a lot of distilleries that tried to copy the Glenlivet name. And as a result, no other distillery today can be licensed to solely use that Glenlivet name. And these two giants are the largest single malt producing distilleries today. And I'd say Glenlivet is sort of squeaking ahead. They sort of, they trade positions, but I think today Glenlivet is a very small bit ahead in terms of production. Now, 5 miles to the north of Glenfiddich is the Macallan, situated next to the River Spey, and this is one of the most dense distillery regions in Scotland. And it has become a controversial distillery amongst the whiskey enthusiasts, mainly because its whiskey is much higher priced than most of the other distilleries. Now, it doesn't make the OSWA top 10, and it doesn't make the Dramface top 40, but it still has a pretty strong following. It's built this new radically design, and the cost was £140 million. The distillery, and it has a uniquely designed multiple dome roof that is covered in grass and wildflowers. It blends so well in the surrounding landscape, it kind of disappears. It's hard to see. If you're at any kind of distance, you have to really look at it because it blends in so well. It actually becomes part of it. Is different from anything else you're going to see in Scotland. It was definitely on my list as one of the distilleries to visit. Now, 4 miles north of Macallan is Glengrant Distillery, which is not just popular selling whiskey, It's also known for Major Grant's expansive gardens, and they're gorgeous, with the many exotic plants he brought back from Africa, India, and other parts of the world.
If someone in your group wants to skip the distillery tour, it's really worth them walking through the Major's gardens. They are spectacular.
Now, 6 miles west of McAllen is Cardew, and it's another classic 200-year-old Speyside distillery. And I think it was the very first distillery that was run by women. And of course, that was Helen Cumming, and then her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth, and that goes back to the mid-1800s. And of course, that in itself is a fascinating story. "10 miles south of Cardew is the stunning-looking Tormore Distillery. And it's kind of sad that this Speyside distillery never had a visitor center. But the good news is Elixir Distillers, who just purchased it, are planning one. And it is known as the Pearl of the Speyside for its granite buildings and balconies, its copper roofing, and its sculptured hedges in its gardens. It has a classic roof clock that played Scottish tunes every quarter hour, and that drove the staff nuts. Can you believe it had a curling pond? Now, in 1986, it was the youngest distillery in the UK to be granted Class B listed heritage status to its buildings. Now, we were at the distillery the only day it was open to tours during the Speyside Festival. And when that new visitor center opens, I highly recommend a visit to Tormore. Now, there are many other popular distilleries that we had visited that were on the Whiskey Trail, and that was including Glenfarclas, Glenallachie, Arbor, and farther to the east, on the outside periphery of the Speyside, is Glendronach. And actually, I think they classify it as a highland. But we're going to head south to Deanston. And that's a highland distillery in central Scotland, and it's 8 miles northwest of the famous Stirling Castle. This huge building was once a very large cotton mill from the late 1700s, and it actually ran all the way up into 1965, and then it was closed. And a year later, it was open to make whiskey. The mill was run, by the River Teith, water power. And it was run on these huge water wheels, which included Hercules. It was the largest in Europe. Now, the building in itself sits in a very unique setting, and it offers one of the better distillery tours. Now, 16 miles southeast of Edinburgh is the 200-year-old Glenkinchie Distillery. And it was one of 3 surviving lowland distilleries before the recent distillery building boom. And it was known as the Edinburgh Malt because of its proximity to Edinburgh. Now, this distillery is definitely worth visiting, but I find when you're staying in Edinburgh, there's just so much to see in that historic city. Good luck trying to get to Glenkinchie. Now it's time to take a look at the island of Islay, Whiskey Island. Now, it's famous for its peated whiskies. And of course, many of the distilleries look similar from the water, but are definitely different when you visit them. On the south coast, you've got Laphroaig, you've got Lagavulin, and you've got Ardbeg. And they're relatively close together, and they are the most visited distilleries on the island. They were isolated by water, so they needed the puffer steamers to bring in their freight and haul out their whiskey.
These white buildings with their large, bold black distillery names facing the ocean are a stunning sight from the water.
Close by is Port Ellen, which was once part of that group, but the distillery was closed in 1983. The malting buildings stayed operating and were a key part supplying many of the Islay's distilleries. Diageo has now built a new Port Ellen distillery, It has a contrasting old and new look, but it still fits into that coastal topography. A few miles to the north is the well-visited Bowmore. It was built in 1779, and it is the oldest distillery on Islay and one of the oldest in Scotland. Here is a dramatic picture of waves crashing on its beach. Across the bay from Bowmore is Bruichladdich, built in 1881, with the coastal stone from the nearby seashore. At that time, it was the most modern distillery in Scotland. It still has much of its original Victorian decor, as well as the equipment and machinery that is still being used for the traditional methods of whiskey making. The movie documentary Water Life tells a compelling story of Bruichladdich, its closure, and then its rebirth, as well as the tumultuous history of the whiskey industry. Just west of Bruichladdich, you have the newer and popular Kilchoman Farm Distillery. And on the sheltered north coast shoreline, looking toward the Isle of Jura, you have Killala, the newly built Ardnahoe, and of course Bunnahabhain, the isolated one. Relatively close to one another. The 180-year-old Killala is noted mostly for its peated whiskey and is the largest distillery on Islay. Its white buildings with its large black lettered name was easy to see by the freight boats from the water. Bunnahabhain was built at the same time as Bruichladdich and is similar in design. It is a strange beauty, something between a fortress and a Bordeaux chateau, with its bold arched entrance gate. It was one of the most isolated distilleries on Islay and was totally reliant on the puffer steamboats. It finally got a narrow road in 1960. For the last 60 years, it has been known for its non-peated whiskies and is one of my favorite drams. It's well worth a visit. As of today, we still have 3 more new distilleries on Islay that are in the process of being built, so good luck when you're trying to visit them all. Now we're going to wander over to some of the other island distilleries of the Hebrides. Now the iconic 200-year-old Talisker is a spectacular setting on the west coast of the Isle of Skye, and was on my priority list to visit. I just didn't stay there long, and if you want to stay there for a couple of days, 2 or 3 days at least, there's just so much to see on the Isle of Skye. Now it reminds me a bit of the coastal Islay distilleries, and is noted for its peated whiskey. The Isle of Skye itself is full of contrast and beauty, and it is the most visited island in the Hebrides. It's the most visited island in Scotland. Now, from the Isle of Skye, it's a short ferry trip to the new and popular Isle of Rosé distillery. Now, Tobermory Distillery is on the Isle of Mull, next to the town of Tobermory, which is known for its colorful buildings on the waterfront. It's a spectacular view when you're coming in on the ferry. It is a survivor of a rocky history of ownership and bad management. The Isle of Mull is the second most visited island in Scotland, and it's a must-see. Also on the distillery tour list is the oldest of the newer distilleries, and that's La Cranza, and that's on the Isle of Arran. It was built in 1994 with its pagodas and its simplistic structures that are pleasing to the eye. And the barren, majestic hills are a scenic backdrop that belong on a postcard. We're gonna kind of do a little wandering away from the Hebrides now, and we're going to go to a little more difficult distillery to get to, and of course that's Highland Park Distillery on the Orkney Islands. Now, if you have the time, it is well worth visiting, but plan a 2.5 hour drive north of Inverness. And it's longer, probably closer to 3.5 hours by rail or bus. And there's still another 2 hours by ferry to get to the Orkneys. So these are islands that you want to stay for 2 to 3 days. You can explore the Norse and the Viking history. You could see Scapa, and that's the second distillery on the Orkneys. Now, we're going to get into some of the newer distilleries. And I'm going to mention Adnamerken. Now, it's pretty remote. It's on the west coast of Scotland, and it is a bit of a drive to get to. Very narrow road. It's a beautiful distillery, and it's actually on a beautiful peninsula. And then there's the new and picturesque Lindores Abbey. It is a lowland distillery, and it's east of Perth, and it's built on a site where the monks had distilled aquavit 600 years earlier. Clydeside is another lowland distillery, which is known for its impressive view of the busy River Clyde, and that is in Glasgow. And on the opposite coast in Edinburgh is the Port of Leith, and that's another lowland distillery. And it's anything but traditional, with its distinctive tall vertical shape. It is known for its panoramic view of the harbor, as well as its famous permanent neighbor, the Royal Yacht Britannia, which also does tours. Now, for most people, there's just too many distilleries to visit, if you actually thought you could visit them all. And that's why we make a list when touring Scotland, and good luck deciding which distilleries are going to be on that list. Now, I'm fortunate enough that I got to visit a lot of distilleries, but it was still only a fraction of what Scotland offers. The fact is, we have 151 operating Scotch distilleries today in Scotland. And many of these new distilleries were built just in the last 10 years, and there's more coming. Now, there will be many distilleries that I haven't mentioned, and I could have missed one of your favorites. But did I see the best of the best? And there still could be an argument as to what is the most amazing and picturesque distillery. Now, we have our own impressions and experiences when we visit a distillery. So maybe what I really should ask is, what is the most photographed and videoed distillery in Scotland? And I do have the answer to that. And that's going to be the Speyside Distillery of Strathisla. And why is it the most photographed and videoed distillery in Scotland? Well, it could be those perfect pagoda roofs, the well-preserved traditional stone buildings. It has a very simplistic design, and it's neatly situated in a really well-manicured garden setting. It is one of the 3 oldest distilleries in Scotland, of course, along with what I've mentioned, Glenturret and Bowmore. And it's been in operation since 1786, and let's face it, it was making whiskey long before that illegally. Besides its photogenic appeal, this iconic distillery gives us a dramatic picture of the past. Since it was acquired by Pernod Ricard in 2001, it's become the face of Chivas. And the whiskey community describe it as a Chivas Disneyland. Now, there are more stories to tell on Strathisla. In fact, there's 240 years of stories. But I'll leave that for the upcoming review on Strathisla and their whiskey that are brought back from the distillery. So I hope these distilleries I've mentioned will help you in preparing your list when you're visiting Scotland. Remind you that the Speyside has at least 60 distilleries, and it is the largest concentration of distilleries per square mile. And that can help you if you're on a short visit. Iowa might have a lot of distilleries. You need to catch a ferry or fly in to get there. And it's become so popular that you've got to book well in advance accommodations and distillery tours. And remember, I've only discussed distilleries. There's a lot more to Scotland. The historic castles, and of course that incredible scenery. So I really recommend you do further research and make this a complete holiday. And then I can ask you, what are the most amazing and beautiful distilleries that you visited? So thanks for hanging in with me and my computer. And on that note, I'm going to ask you to drink wisely, drink intelligently, and do not drink and drive. Until the next time, so much fun.